thinking. And so what they did was, I believe that like in English, when we have a fairly conversation we say we had a conversation for a long time. We had a long chat. So what we are doing is that we are converting the dimension of time into dimension of length, long, right? That's how we speak in English. Time is converted into a dimension of length. In Russian, I believe, I don't know Russian, but according to that, what I read, in Russia, they convert the unit of time into unit of weight. So if they have a conversation for a long period, they say, oh, we had something to do with heaviness. It becomes a heavy conversation. So this experiment was very simple. They put these English-speaking people in one room, and they projected a small line, a one-dimensional line on the screen for, let's say, 1 second. And then they projected a very large, long line for 1 second. And they asked the English-speaking crowd in the audience which line stayed longer on the screen. And most of them said the longer line stayed longer, even though they'd stayed for exactly the same amount of time. Then they asked the same question to Russian-speaking crowd, and the answer was different. They said about the same. They didn't feel that the longer line stayed longer. Now they reversed the experiment and they put a very light object for 1 second and a heavy object for the same amount of time with both the English crowd and the Russian crowd. And this time the Russian-speaking people said the heavier stuff stayed longer on the screen. So, it's because the mind associates weight with time. So they look at when they see that, they also, the immediately association is of that. So I think this runs deeper. If we think in a certain language, our perceptions are also molded by that language. This issue also needs to be, this can open many doors about the dominating language, how it is changing our perceptions and alienating us from the way we have been looking at things. There is no right and wrong here. It's just the way you look at nature, at relationships, at people around you. If you come from a certain culture and if you come from a different culture, you see it in a different way. So this is not to say that this is a superior way of seeing or this is an inferior way of seeing, but showing that, these are all different ways of seeing. And some people look at it like this and some people look at it like this. Now, these are many things which I think if you can bring in the school, then this will bring different cultures, bring different perspectives on par, rather than one thing dominating the rest.
Yeah, I think that is exactly the point. And that's part of the reason why I'm happy we are having this conversation. Because to put it simply, colonization goes much deeper than we think. Usually, colonization, that's all true. There's economical colonization, there's political colonization, but then we even can talk about Western ideology and modernism. I think people would agree on that. But the simple fact that Western languages, the use of Western language is a colonizing factor.
Yes.
I think that's something that's really in the shadow at this point. That
Absolutely.
It's just the fact that that we are talking, using mostly English right now in a Western language that's completely embedded and grown by Western history, and that we force this language on each other. And I also, just to be straight, I don't know the answer, because there's something where it also makes complete sense. We are living in one world and we need a kind of a second language to communicate with each other. So I'm not saying it's a bad it's a bad thing because it definitely helps us to have this conversation right now. If we would, I'm not a native English speaker. You're not a native English speaker. We are using English. Otherwise, it would be difficult right now to have this conversation. So I'm grateful for that. But at the same time, I think it's an important step to just be aware. Here we are coming back to the pointing out. Just to the pointing out that there's something going on that really has an impact, and that what we are talking about, to allow different cultures to be on par, on par. If we want that, we have to be aware of the structural differences in communication in order to just have a starting point for this. And as I said at the beginning, this is much more obvious in the global south than it is in the global north, because we are basically exporting our structures, you are importing our structures. There was also something in the other conversation we had a couple of weeks ago that struck me very much, which has to do with the Western scientific worldview, and where you were bringing the example of an everyday modern Indian, not necessarily an university education level, but just usual high school education level, who is so basically in some way religiously embedded in Western scientific thinking that his or her relationship to the villagers' thinking, quote unquote, is one of complete superiority, because he basically thinks what these dumb villagers, or what you're just describing before, is just pure superstition. And because of the political structure, of course, of the power structures in the world, there is an embedded feeling of inferiority in this, built in the structure, that at least we have to look at in order to understand what we are doing to these cultures, like the Indian cultures and most of the southern cultures, and see a way, if we want to start a global dialogue, we have to find ways beyond that. I don't know how this can look like. We have to see how this can look like. But if we're really serious to have a global conversation, a global dialogue, we have to find ways to go beyond this, because otherwise it's just a dominating dialogue. It's not a dialogue. It's basically a one-way conversation, really.
I think it's important what you're saying, Thomas, and I'm actually heartened by conversations like with you, Pawan, and conversation that we had a little while ago with Pai Villaratsa from the Philippines, people who are working within their own context to raise up these questions, and also to work to find ways to kind of honor and create parity of view, from be able to see eye to eye. But it requires a real capacity for self-reflection and an understanding of one's culture in a very big context in order to be able to do that. And that's the kind of education that I think is really important now, for so that and that's even amongst people like us, to be able to be able. And still, it has to be translated into a language that we all can understand, which makes it so difficult. But to recognize that there are forms of consciousness, forms of mind, categories of thinking that reveal the world and revealed reality being humanness in profoundly with different degrees of subtlety and in different ways. And that even though, as you said at the beginning, there are these ways that we all can experience humanness in similar ways, that, I know what I wanted to say, that the fact of this inferiority and that is being that has happened as a result of the domination of the West, a result of that, because that is so pervasive in the world. We're not going to get to a positive politics without dealing with this, because without really recognizing and really being able to lift up and honor the ways of knowing and the ways of being and understanding and the wisdom that is held in different contexts, we're not going to be able to have political solutions that are going to create the kind of parity and mutual respect that will be needed to create a viable globe, a viable global reality. Pawan.
Oh. Pawan,
you are muted. You are.
Try to unmute you, but I'm not able to.
Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, what I was saying is that, you mentioned self-reflection. I would just add two more things: sensitivity and authenticity. If that can be the common ground between, people trying to understand each other and appreciate each other, these are three essential ingredients, and how do we cultivate this? How do we cultivate the tendency for self-reflection, to being sensitive to oneself and the other, and being authentic? And they are related. They are not unrelated. They are not in isolation. They are all interconnected. If this can be somehow cultivated, I think what we are talking about it can give some encouragement to that kind of thing emerging.
Great.
Now, of course, one has to apply. We can share our thoughts and write something about it and share with each other, and then see what happens with that.
Great.
Okay.
Then I'd like to with that question that you just raised, which is how can we create a context of self-reflection